Greetings and welcome to another episode of Veterans of the Cedar Valley. My name is Tom Haggerty and I'll be your host for this show. In previous episodes we have had veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq on our show to tell us about their experiences. And we've also had subjects of interest to veterans and their families. And today in our studio, I'm tickled to finally have two women veterans who served in the military, and both were nurses, and Betty Butler and Cheryl Neal, and we're going to visit with them about their experiences in the service. Betty, why don't you start and give us a little background of what you did and where you're at now.
Okay. I was inducted actually in 72 as an enlisted person going to college. It was a scholarship program. And so the Navy paid for my junior and senior year of college, and then I owed them 3 years of active duty. So I ended up going to summer school, so I was done end of 73. So I was on active duty 74, 75, 76.
And Cheryl, a little background bio on you, and then we'll start the program.
Sure. I was actually commissioned the day I graduated from college. I'm a UW Oshkosh graduate, and there were 6 of us in our class who were actually commissioned that day, and that was in the summer of 1983. So I actually had graduated and didn't know the Navy anything.
So you went to UW, Wisconsin, and you went to where, Betty?
South Dakota State University in Brookings.
And were they nursing colleges, Betty?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, the
Cheryl?
Bachelor
Both?
of Science in Nursing.
Okay.
That's-
And that was the field that you wanted to go into, Cheryl?
Absolutely.
Was nursing,
Yeah.
Betty? Good. When you got recruited to be in the service, and you went right in, did you go to basic training, Betty?
Well, once I graduated from college, then I went to Newport, Rhode Island. We had a 6-week indoctrination, officer indoctrination there in Newport, Rhode Island, right?
And that was a Navy station?
Yep.
And then Cheryl, the same thing?
The same thing.
Neither one of you, though, had to go through basic training, what we
Not
started
like
out
what
with.
the enlisted
Yes.
people go
Okay.
through now.
No, or officer candidates go, but we still had, we had to learn how to march. We had to learn how to keep our rooms clean. There
we
were
had
some
to-
other things that, so it wasn't all fun and games, but it was certainly not what, the enlisteds went
Right.
through.
And Betty, what was your rank when you were first started in the Navy?
Well, six months before I graduated, I was commissioned as an ensign. And so then I was an ensign for 1 year, and then was promoted to Lieutenant JG, Lieutenant Junior grade.
And did you have a specialty, or what? Nursing was your specialty, but nothing like orthopedics or anything like that?
They assign you where they want you, and they assigned me to the neurosurgical floor, which would have been about the last thing that I would have picked. Neurosurgical was spinal cord injuries, head injuries, anything to do with the brain and the spine. Yeah.
And where were you assigned after?
I was at Oakland, California, at the Naval Regional Medical Center there. They called it Oak Knoll.
And
So-
that was a pretty big looking hospital.
Very big, very
Yeah.
big.
And you
yeah.
remember how many beds they had? Or
I believe there was 800 beds or so at the time. It
Wow.
was 9 stories, 4 wings.
was it the largest Navy hospital?
I don't believe so. No, I
Okay.
don't believe so.
And Cheryl, when you got out of the initial training, what was your rank and where were you assigned?
Okay. I was an ensign, just like Betty. Only it had changed because I was about, 11 years after Betty. So I was an ensign for 2 years and then became a lieutenant junior grade. And then after about another year and a half or so, made lieutenant or 03.
Okay, the ranks are very different in the military. An ensign is the equivalent of a lieutenant.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, and You ended up your career at what rank?
As a lieutenant, which would be similar to a captain in the
Okay.
Air Force of the
Betty,
Army.
what did you end up with?
Right, I was the Lieutenant JG when I got out. I
And
was
you had to serve how many years?
3 years active duty.
And
yeah.
Cheryl, how many did you?
I actually served 6 because my first 3 was at Naval Hospital Great Lakes. And the joke is I joined the Navy to see the world, and I ended up 150 miles from home.
Oh my. Oh
So, except I did find my husband, so that was good. That was the trade-off for not seeing the world. So I was at Naval Hospital Great Lakes for 3 years, and then I asked to extend or to stay on for another 3. So then I taught at Naval Hospital Corps School for 3 years.
Did that extension of 3 years, Cheryl, get you another promotion in rank?
No, because I was promoted right about the time that I switched commands. So.
Okay. Betty, did you go overseas at all in your career?
No.
And
I
Cheryl,
was
did you?
No.
stateside the whole
Stateside?
time.
Well, so did I. So, but I mean, but the rank confuses me because I just had stripes and I was a medic in a 1,000-bed hospital. So, tell me, Betty, one of the special stories you might have remembered from your service time. You know,
Oh, wow.
just one.
Just, yeah, it was a very hectic floor with spinal cord injury patients there. A lot of them were not combat related. We had, the Bay Area had gobs of sailors, lots of ships. And a lot of them were car accidents, motorcycle accidents, that sort of thing. And we would have guys that were spinal cord injuries, and they're paralyzed. They would be on turning frames and things like that. It was a very busy time.
Was that the big circular bed?
Well, we had some of those, but these were the kind that you would flip from side to side.
Oh, okay. And Cheryl, same thing. Well, tell me a story that you can remember that you still remember to this day.
Well, we had medical and surgical units. Great Lakes at one point had been a very active hospital, but by the time I was there, they were kind of on their downsizing. And so, on a medical unit or on the surgical unit, we would often have, 34 patients. And in the afternoons and at night, we would be the only nurse with the corpsman. And we'd have 2 or 3 corpsmen. So, it was all about building trust and, training, because the 3 of you had to take care of, 34 patients at a time and know everything about them.
And Betty, did you help in surgical or surgical theaters in the hospitals?
No. Mm-mm.
Okay. Basically, it was nursing duties on the floors.
Very acute, very acute care on the floor. Right?
Okay, I gotta ask both of you, since I was a terrible shot and they made me a medic in the Air Force. Did you have to learn any weapons, Betty?
No. Well, actually, I guess in our indoctrination, they did take us to a shooting range one time, and they taught us how to. I couldn't even tell you what kind of a gun it was. We shot a handgun of some kind.
Okay.
But we did have to do that and learn about safeties and things like that.
Were you a good shot?
No,
Okay.
not at all.
Cheryl, same question.
Yeah, same thing. There was the time at the officer indoctrination school, but actually when we left active duty and came to the Cedar Valley, I was in the reserves for a year, and I thought it would be fun to earn my pistol shooting ribbon or whatever, but no, I was not a good shot, so did not, don't think I succeeded at that.
Was that the Naval Reserve here in Waterloo?
Yes, it was.
That is now not there, but
Right.
Betty, did they close your hospital?
They closed it, probably 10 or 15 years ago, I believe. And it was sad. They tore it down, and I've seen pictures online of them. It just sat empty for many years, and it was trashed, and then they ended up tearing it down, right?
Cheryl, in Great Lakes?
Great Lakes is down. The Naval Recruit Command is still there, and the Naval Training Station is still there, but the entire hospital side is now, it's a beautiful park, and it's on the shores of Lake Michigan, so I'm sure it's a pretty pricey piece of real estate.
How many, Betty, just a wild guess, Navy personnel were at your hospital location?
Oh, I have no idea. There were 200 and some nurses, I know, but then there were probably 3 times that many corpsmen and a lot of physicians. They had a residency program there for docs, and so we had residents, physicians in different levels of their residency that worked with us.
Cheryl, at Great Lakes Hospital, how many medical personnel?
You know, I really don't remember. I would say there was probably 75 nurses while I was there. But then you have the medical service corps, and they had an oral surgery residency program for military members. And we did a lot of joint sharing with the North Chicago VA at that time. Because as the hospital was diminishing in size, we had all these corpsmen that needed training. So we would take our students to the North Chicago VA where they could practice on the veterans the skills that they were learning.
Okay. We've arrived at our halfway point of today's show, and we're going to take a break here, have some commercials to help pay for the bills, and we'll be right back. Please come back and join us. Welcome back to the second half of our show, The Veterans of the Cedar Valley. My name is Tom Haggerty. I'll be your host for this show. Today's episode, we've been visiting with 2 military nurses, both Navy nurses, Betty Butler and Cheryl McNeil, and we want to get back to talking to you two about your career in the Navy. Betty, besides being a nurse, not just besides being a nurse, what other roles at the time you were in the service were women allowed to be in?
We had female corpsmen. We called them corps waves at the time, so they were there. There were women in all different kinds of positions in the lab and officers and so forth, but we were not allowed on ships at all. At that time, females were not assigned on ships.
So a woman could not go out onto a Navy ship even though they were in a Navy?
Right. Not
Wow.
to be assigned there at all. No,
Okay.
not allowed.
Cheryl, same question. What other roles were women allowed when you were serving?
Okay. Well, you know, I saw, women in, advanced leadership positions. We have a very good friend that spends part of her year here in the Cedar Valley, and she was a commanding officer of the Naval Training Command out in Virginia. But in the nurse corps, there was one rear admiral who was the chief nurse of the nurse corps. Our direct supervisor was a captain or a colonel in 06. But other Navy nurses and Navy women at that time could pretty much do anything except, like Betty said, we still, were not welcome on ships. At the end of my time, the Mercy and the Comfort, the hospital ships, were being recommissioned, and female nurses could then end up being assigned to one of those.
Betty, today women can serve in combat roles, but back then when you were in the Navy, they weren't allowed on combat,
Right.
and they weren't allowed on a ship. It's just
Right.
kind of weird. well, no, never mind. But they like Cheryl said, they were in command leadership roles. Who was in charge of all the nurses where you worked in California?
We had supervisors on each floor who were commanders or lieutenant commanders. And then we had a captain in the nurse corps who was in charge of all the nurses in the hospital. She was quite intimidating, but.
And her rank again was what?
Captain.
Captain.
Which would have been, that's just below admiral in the Navy, yeah.
And Cheryl, same thing. Who was your leader or commander?
Yeah, actually, as a floor nurse, we would have had a lieutenant or lieutenant commander. I actually had the opportunity because we had a shortage of that rank at the time, so I actually had an opportunity to fill in for 6 months. So it gave me my first taste of nursing leadership, and that was very rewarding. But just like Betty said, we had a captain who was in charge. Although the captain, we had Captain Lockney, I would never forget her. She was very kind and compassionate. She certainly did not eat her young. And she was very, in tune to what we thought and wanted to keep us in the Navy rather than scare us out. So she was kind and compassionate. But the other thing about her she had spent some time in Vietnam is as a very young nurse from the Midwest, I was so impressed because she had a tattoo.
Was that allowed?
I don't know, but I didn't know any women that had a tattoo at that point, so that was really impressive to me.
In the service, yeah, too. Betty, in your hospital, which you said was approximately about 800 beds, how many departments would you say were, like the hospital I served, we had 8 departments, like heart department, surgery, orthopedics, otolaryngology.
Yeah, we probably had that many too. The last 6 months or so that I was in active duty, I worked in OB, in labor and delivery, with the nursery and all of that sort of thing. So we had everything. We had a surgical ICU, a cardiac CCU, medical ICU. We had all kinds of different services, yeah.
And Cheryl, in your hospital, how many different departments did you have?
I would say we had all the same, but we had one that probably wasn't something you thought about then, and you certainly wouldn't think about it today. We had the chickenpox ward. Because, being at Great Lakes and there's thousands of recruits coming through every year, at that time there wasn't vaccines for chickenpox, and so a lot of our recruits would end up with chickenpox, and you couldn't send them home, and you couldn't keep them in the barracks because they would just give it to everybody else. So they would isolate them. So we would have anywhere from 30 to 36 recruits, in the hospital in an isolation ward until they recovered from chickenpox.
Were they, Betty, did you have chickenpox in California in your hospital?
I did not know of any cases of chickenpox there, no.
That wouldn't have got you kicked out of the Navy, right? Because they had, like Cheryl said, they'd had to treat you. Were there any injuries that Navy personnel, when you served at your hospital, done locally, that somebody got hurt in a car accident and they bring you to the Navy hospital, or would they bring you to the civilian hospital in the area?
If they were Navy, or Marines, they would come to the Navy hospital, yeah, or their dependents. We had a lot of dependents also.
So Marines rode along with the Navy, correct?
Marines, yep, and that was the combat patients that we did have, the post-combat patients that we had were Marines that were shipped back from Vietnam that had head injuries and so forth.
So did you go and get these injured Marines, like say in Vietnam or the Philippines, and fly them in?
They would be shipped out. I'm not sure how they were shipped out. First, they would usually stop at the Philippines or Hawaii to stabilize them, get them, and then they would come to us for if they needed further treatment and their rehab, and if they needed surgical correction and stuff.
Okay. And Cheryl, the chicken pox, or what was it? Yeah, chicken pox.
Yep, chickenpox.
Were they released from the service after the
Oh,
Navy
no.
treated them?
No, typically with chickenpox, it takes about 7 to 10 days to recover. And once they were not contagious anymore, they could go back and resume their training. So
When they
no.
were being treated, do you have to isolate them?
Oh yeah, that's why we had the unit in the hospital. It was an unused ward, and so they were there, and there was no frills, and they were treated just like they would have been as a recruit, because you didn't want them to get too comfortable, because then they didn't want to leave and go back to training. So they were just isolated for a short period of time. And
We had a lot of recruits who did not want to go back from the hospital to
Yes.
their basic training,
Yes.
because most of the time their destination after being basic training was either Vietnam or some other place. And Betty, I'm going to ask you a question. Today, would you recommend to young women to go in the military and as a nurse or become a medical personnel?
Definitely. Yep. It's a very good experience.
And did you use your experience from being a nurse in civilian life?
Oh, yes. I mean, I was a new graduate and I got it was thrown into the fire, and I learned a lot very quickly. You had to, because you were, like Cheryl said, you were in charge of, on PMs, evenings and nights, you were in charge of one floor, or I actually had 2 wards, with probably 3 or 4 corpsmen on each ward. And you were in charge and you had to learn. So yeah, and then I continued in nursing.
Okay, so it's been a good career. Okay,
Right.
Cheryl, same question. Would you recommend to young women who wanted to go into the military to check out nursing or become a nurse and go into the military?
Oh, absolutely. And I think they have so many more opportunities today than we would have in the 70s or 80s. But it was the leadership. And there was a senior nurse that I worked with at the very beginning who said, you're a nurse, but you're also an officer. And so you were expected to lead. You were expected to do what was right. And so I used all of that experience in my career here, in Cedar Falls, Waterloo.
And you're in nursing still?
Yes, I am.
In the area. And both of you did a great job helping soldiers no matter where you were. And before we close our show, I want to ask you again, Betty, what made you go into the military?
They recruited us. They came and talked to our nursing class and told us about all the wonderful things we should do. I was too chicken to join the Army, where I knew that I could be in Vietnam, but the Navy sounded really good, and the scholarship part of it really drew me too. They needed nurses badly at the time, and so that scholarship was worth a lot. Yeah.
Did they promise you anything other than just being in the Navy? Did they tell you couldn't go on a ship?
Yeah, I knew that.
Oh, okay.
They made that clear to us that it would be in a hospital. I could have gone overseas to like Guam or Okinawa after I'd been in for 3 years, but I knew that my first 3 years would be stateside. So.
And Cheryl, same question. You were a nurse before you went into the military?
At graduation, so the Navy was my first experience.
And like Betty, did they come and recruit you at your nursing school? Or?
No, I actually, when I graduated from college in 1983, it was hard to get a nursing position. Unlike today where, every hospital is out recruiting every nurse that's graduating. But it was hard. There were no openings, and I really didn't want to stay in the local hospital. I wanted to do something else. So it was actually a nursing professor who took me aside and said, have you ever considered the military? And she had been a Navy nurse. And she was a professor I really respected. And so I started to investigate what would be my possibilities.
Betty, if I was thinking about being a nurse, can I call you and talk to you about being a nurse?
Sure.
I'm talking young women
Yeah.
or anybody. I mean, you can be a male and be a nurse.
Sure.
And would you still recommend going into the military?
Sure, definitely.
Cheryl, you too?
Absolutely.
So you thought it was a great career and you did your job, and again, we appreciate what both of you did in the service as nurses, and you can't be in a hospital without nurses taking care of you. I mean, a doctor comes in about 3 minutes, you don't see him. But I appreciate what you did, and I'm tickled to death that I was able to not only get one of you, but both of you at the same time to be on our show. And I want to thank you for your service, and I hope that you continue in your careers like you're doing, and we appreciate you being on the show today. We've come to the end of our show, and I'd like to thank Betty Butler and Cheryl Neal for their contribution as a veteran and nurse. And please tune in again next time. We'll have another show on another subject. Thank you very much.